Good evening. It's exactly 50 years ago this month that the Abortion Act was passed, making what had been a crime once punished by the death penalty or transportation for life conditionally legal in Britain. Since then, 9 million abortions have taken place here, and the changes in social attitudes that produced the Act have, if anything, accelerated. Yet abortion remains among the most controversial of moral issues, a continuing argument over what it is to be human and the sanctity of life. An argument, to mark the anniversary, we're having tonight in front of a mainly young audience at University College London. And in a first for the Moral Maze, you can follow a special real-time analysis of the argument on Twitter. Now, few would maintain that all the 200,000 abortions a year fulfil the strict conditions of the Act, that the mother would face a grave permanent injury or a life-threatening risk in continuing the pregnancy, or the child risk being seriously handicapped. De facto, if not de jure, many say we now have abortion on demand. The central question is still how we should regard the conceived but as yet unborn. At what point does a collection of cells become a morally discrete human being? Right from conception, not until birth, or the point legally defined at 24 weeks, but thanks to medical advances shrinking all the time, the age at which it might survive independently? It's more than an argument between the biological and moral autonomy of the mother, a woman's right to choose, and the sanctity of life. Many, including the British Medical Association, want abortion decriminalised completely, a decision for the mother alone, just another, albeit regulated, medical procedure. Others worry potential human lives are being thrown away for convenience or fashion, gender selection, for instance. 50 years on, the rights and wrongs of abortion. Our Moral Maze tonight, our panel, Anne McElvoy, Senior Editor at The Economist, Claire Fox from the Institute of Ideas, the historian Tim Stanley, and the priest and polemicist Giles Fraser. Claire, where do you stand on this?
So first of all, I'd say that I'm pro-choice, not pro-abortion. Not because I'm squeamish about abortion, but because it's none of my business, really, whether a woman decides to continue a pregnancy or to end it. It's her choice to make. So for me, it's firmly about women. Secondly, I just quickly would say that the law was a step forward in 1967, but it did not make abortion free as a choice. And I think that it needs to be decriminalised, turn into just a normal medical procedure, and we should get the law out of it.
Anne McElvoy.
Well, I view the abortion question as one of the most persistently difficult that we have addressed on the Moral Maze for two reasons. One is that it's a sliding scale of benefits and harms for all but the absolutists. And the other is that the medical advances to which Michael referred are now so great that I think we have to be prepared to assess and reassess our position as time moves on and medicine and medical technology make changes. And I think that's also an interesting and fraught ethical territory I hope to get to tonight.
Tim Stanley.
Here it's said that abortion should be safe, legal and rare. By that standard, the 1967 Act has failed because close to 200,000 babies are aborted every year in the UK. I'll be arguing that. My hope is to convince people that if abortion is not murder, it at least definitely involves the taking of human life. And for that reason, it is not merely a private matter, but a moral question for the whole of society.
Giles Fraser.
I don't like the language of pro-choice and I don't like the language of pro-life. I think we need to get beyond some of that to really see what's going on here. I think the right person to decide about an abortion is the woman who's pregnant, not a court, not a doctor, not a church, certainly not a church. But I think that definitely are moral issues here and they can't be brushed under the carpet.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Aisling Hubert, who works for the anti-abortion pressure group Centre for Bioethical Reform and is so passionate about it, she brought a private prosecution against two doctors alleged to have offered abortion for gender selection. It failed, left her with a bill for £47,000. So you feel strongly against abortion for any reason, at any time?
Well, I believe that every single human being, regardless of race, religion, gender, or age, deserves the right to life. And so when we look at abortion itself, we need to say, what is the act of abortion, and does it intentionally kill an innocent human being, or is it simply a gentle suction to remove a pregnancy, as the British Medical Advisory Service call it? And to determine that, we need to look at what does science say about the beginning of human life. And it's very clear that at the moment of fertilisation, you have a distinct living and whole human being, and they shouldn't be discriminated against.
Claire Fox.
So just to clarify, you think that the fetus is as much of a human being in the same sense that we all are in this room today?
If they are, well, we know at the moment of fertilization you're human because you have human parents. We know that you're alive because you're growing. And we know that you are a whole human being. You're not like a skin cell or something that, brushes off your hand. You're whole. So therefore, if you are all of those things, what else do you need to have human rights?
Well, we'll go back onto that. But, I mean, you yourself said regardless of age, but actually your age starts when you're born, as it happens. But anyway, can I just check, do you think late abortions are morally worse than early abortions? There's some confusion.
No, not at all. I believe that at the moment of fertilization, it's very clear, just with science, that a new human life has begun. And,
okay. No, that's really good. So you're morally consistent. I get that point. Therefore, you must campaign vigorously for abortion to be made illegal. That must be your consistent position. Is that what you argue for?
Well, I believe that once abortion is known for what it is, it will be made unthinkable.
I know, but I'm asking, are you campaigning for it to be made illegal?
Yeah, well, absolutely. If it is a human being, then every single human being deserves the right to life.
The reason I was asking that is because I followed the anti-abortion case quite carefully because I was involved in pro-life politics till I was 19, arguing for that position. But somebody persuaded me out of it and I changed my mind. So I've always been interested. But I've noticed that a lot of the time now, a lot of people on the pro-life side have started to be quite pragmatic morally and start saying, well, maybe we could stop late abortions. I just wondered how you felt about your own side's moral cowardice there in terms of not actually going the full hog and just saying, no, we want it banned outright.
Well, like with all forms of injustice, there's different strategies that people would wish to take to see it come to an end. And so I don't think that that's wrong for people to have different strategies. As long as the goal is always to... laws are there to protect life. And so everything that we should be doing should be with the goal of looking at, are these human beings and are their lives worth protecting?
Okay, so that's a fair point. On the strategy, last question... one of the strategies used, you said if we could only show people or indicate to people what makes abortion so abhorrent, is to show people the procedure, the abortion procedure. It's pretty gory. And I know that's deployed by a lot of anti-abortion groups. I just wanted to know, if you showed me a picture of the procedure of having my appendix out, I'd probably get sick and never go to the doctors again or never go in a hospital. Isn't that just scaremongering and a tactic that actually isn't that helpful for your side?
Okay, but the difference between a life-saving procedure like having your appendix removed and an abortion is that one's a life-saving procedure and the other one intentionally kills an innocent human being.
If it's used as a show as education, I'll pass on to
Anne McKelvey.
Yeah.
Picking up the baton here on this one, actually, if you had your way and you were able to make plainer to people what an abortion entails in detail, and if a sizable number of people then still continue to have abortions, would you then accept that you might have been wrong about that?
Well, I think abortion has been so clouded in euphemisms like choice, reproductive freedom, healthcare, that I do think a vast majority of people, if they went online and if they just viewed an abortion procedure itself, they'd be shocked to find, oh my goodness, look, That's
not a moral category, is it? That's a category of squeamishness, as Claire pointed out. I don't want to see a picture of Claire having her appendix out either. You say this is different because it's about the destruction of life. And I take the point, but if you could see it through my eyes, is the rallying cry of the campaigner. A lot of people simply wouldn't necessarily share your view. Why would that affect the ethical debate one way or the other?
In order for injustice to be brought to an end, people first have to see it. In order to shift public opinion, people need to be made aware of what the issue is about.
You think that would do it. Let's move onwards. Aren't there? The reason that I find this question so morally fraught, and I've also slightly shifted my position around term limits over time, is that there is harm involved here, as well as to the unborn child. There is harm to the mother if she wanted an abortion and in your scheme of things wouldn't be able to have it because she made a choice that she would prefer not to continue the pregnancy. There is potential harm to the child being born to a mother who, if properly informed, didn't want to bring that child into the world. So why does your moral case have an end point of dealing with the abortion, not the consequences of the failure to have the abortion?
Well, what could be more harmful to a child than them literally being decapitated limb by limb in an abortion procedure? So I care so much about women and their children that I think they need all the information, and their children deserve to be protected because they're little girls as well in the womb. Yeah.
Okay, Aisling Hewitt. Thanks very much indeed. Next witness is Professor Wendy Savage, who's a retired gynecologist who performed 10,000 abortions herself, and I'm sure you won't mind me saying is one of the few people who can remember what it was like before the Act. Is it your case, Professor Savage, 50 years on, that the Act, even implemented as loosely as it is, doesn't go far enough?
Well, I don't think abortion should be treated as a crime. It should be a medical matter. In 1961, suicide stopped being a crime, and I think it's now time to stop abortion being a crime. It was made a crime because of the risk to the woman, and it's no longer a sensible thing to have an 1861 Act.
Tim Stanley.
Professor Savage, at the present time in the United Kingdom, 24 weeks is the upper limit for an abortion. Could you, in your experience, describe what a baby looks like in the womb at 24 weeks?
Well, it looks like a miniature baby.
So head, heart beating, arms, legs.
Look, the reason a woman would have an abortion at 24 weeks or above is usually because there is a serious fetal abnormality. Of the abortions that were done in the last year, all of them were classified as due to fetal abnormality.
OK, I take that point, but at 24 weeks, that's 6 months, it looks like a baby. Can you tell me what the survival rate is for a baby born prematurely at 24 weeks?
Well, it's better than it used to be. I can't give you the exact figure. It may be...
It's about 60%.
Yes.
It's about 60%. Born at 23 weeks, in some hospitals, according to the Times of this year, it's actually at 70%. So that's a pretty good chance of a premature baby at 24 weeks actually living.
Look, the Times is hardly a medical journal, and it's not an unselected sample.
Oh, no, but it's quoting from
70%.
NHS trusts. It's quoting from NHS trusts.
Yes, but you've got to take the whole population, and the Epicure studies have shown quite clearly that the survival rate is not very great at 23 weeks. But I don't think that's the point. You have to think about the woman. And the point of the 67 Act was to stop women dying from illegal abortion.
OK, that's fine. Let's move on in that case. The Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists says that there's a serious shortage of doctors who are willing to perform abortions after 12 weeks within the NHS, which is why so often women have to go to private providers instead. Why might a doctor be unwilling to perform an abortion after 12 weeks?
Well, doctors are not immune from these feelings of squeamishness that other people have, but they probably haven't spent a lot of time listening to women, and they've certainly never seen women dying. And Is
it not because after 12 weeks one has to dismember the baby in order to remove it from the womb?
After 16 weeks, you had to dismember it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Giles Fraser.
I'm with you about being reluctant to criminalise, and I'm with you about... I mean, I don't want to go back to the sort of Vera Drake era and all of that stuff, which was absolutely horrendous. But it seems to me that there is a difference between a sort of good reason and a bad reason to make a decision. I want to know what a moral discussion looks like about whether to have this, irrespective of criminalisation and so forth. I'm with you on that. But it seems to me that there are some reasons which are better than other reasons. If you were talking to a friend or someone who was contemplating this procedure, what would a moral discussion look like between you and them about this?
Well, I don't think it's up to doctors to have moral discussions.
I'm talking about friends.
Patients.
That's why I put it in that terms.
And I think you have to realise that it's the woman who has the baby. It's the woman whose body is changed. It's usually the woman who then spends the next 60, 70 years looking after the child, and it's up to her to decide what to do.
No, I share that. I agree with you.
Yes,
I agree with you. I'm not disputing that, but I'm saying if someone comes to you and wants to have a discussion, wants to make her mind up and wants to have a moral discussion about this, granted it's her decision, but she's seeking your advice, you know quite a lot about it and so forth, And you might want to have a moral discussion here. And it seems to me, if all you say is it's just your choice, then not much moral discussion is going to happen.
Well, I estimate that I've done about 10,000 abortions in my career. And I can only remember one woman who came and said, I think abortion is wrong, but I want an abortion. Now, there was a situation where you could have a moral discussion, but the others have never asked to have a moral discussion. It's a practical solution to something that they wish had never happened.
One practical medical thing. There is talk that there is such a thing coming as artificial wombs. Now, whether this is true or not, I don't know. But the idea that you may be able to take a very, not very developed fetus and take it out and grow it in an artificial womb. So I want to know what you think the woman is a right to. Is it a right to not carry the fetus, or is it a right to terminate the fetus?
It's the right to terminate the fetus, and I think that the decision to have an abortion should not rely on whether or not the fetus is viable. I mean, abortion, by definition, is the ending of a pregnancy before viability, which we take as 24 weeks now. But in practice, women don't come to you after 24 weeks unless they've got real problems with their mental health. They've got learning disabilities and their carers didn't notice they were pregnant. It's not something that women do. They come to you before 24 weeks on the whole.
Professor Savage, thank you very much indeed. Our next witness is Ed Condon, who's a Catholic canon lawyer who works for tribunals in a number of dioceses, writes for the Catholic Herald. Yours is a pretty absolutist position, as I understand it. Wrong at any time, in any circumstances, because it amounts to the taking of human life. Is that your position?
I think that every child from the moment of conception has a distinct genetic character. It's recognizable as human life. And if society and law has any function, it's surely to protect human life.
Anne McElvoy.
Mr. Khan, can I ask you if you think this is a theological consideration, a moral one, or a mixture of the two?
I think it's a question of fundamental human rights. I wouldn't call it theological. It was Christopher Hitchens who said that if you accept that the concept of a child has any meaning, then the concept of an unborn child has to have meaning.
And you use the language of rights rather than morality because you find the moral argument too slippery, or another reason?
No, because I like to take things to the bedrock of the argument. In this case, it's a case of fundamental human rights, and I think the most fundamental human right is the right to life.
Is the difficult argument here one which we referred to in the introduction, which is really technology, medical advances, and term limits rather than the absolutes? Now, the absolutes are quite comfortable positions to argue from. If you're on your side of the argument or your predecessor, you simply say right to life, there we go. If you're on the other side, you say, as Wendy Savage, I think in some phrases has just done, that it's not really a moral issue, it's a clinical, it's a medical one. Most of us who are confused, who are searching for the right way to think about this, are somewhere in the middle and worrying about viability and term limits. Is that not the moral territory you should be in?
No. I don't accept that viability should have any bearing on whether or not a person enjoys the right to life. If we're going to accept viability as a criteria, then what about people who are permanently infirm? If we're going to say that an unborn child isn't able to have its own heartbeat, what about people with pacemakers? If we're saying that a child can't breathe on its own, what about people on ventilators? If it's a question of brain function and sentience, what about people in comas?
Are you trying to tell me that taking a morning after pill is equivalent to taking the life of a well-developed fetus?
No, I'm saying if you
months?
accept viability as a criteria for human life, it's a slippery slope, and I don't like where that goes. I think if you've got a genetically distinct human life, it is life.
But you may not like where it goes, but can I just press you again? Are you saying that there is an equivalence then between either very early abortion or indeed forms of aborting, making sure that the fetus does not develop, like the morning after pill, and late abortion? Are you really making that equivalence?
I'm saying there is no difference between ending a human life at any point.
And
now,
it's
you
equally
can
wrong.
Well, you can argue the context of when it's okay to end a human life if you like, but I would say that if there's a fundamental human right, it's the right to life, and life begins at conception. That's when we have, and there's medical consensus on this, that's when a distinct genetic human life begins. If we saw a clump of cells, which is what we choose to call a newly conceived child, if we found that living in the way that it does, reproducing at the rate that it does, demonstrating all the characteristics that it does on Mars, we wouldn't say, here's a clump of cells. We'd say, this is life on Mars. Why would we call something life on Mars but not in a womb?
There's a moral sentiment, isn't there, as well as hyper-rationalism. Do you really feel the same about the two cases?
I don't think that human rights require sentiment. I think that they're a position of you either have the right or you don't.
Exceptional circumstances we accept in law, but also in many difficult subjects we've handled on the moral maze and elsewhere. So I'm just going to go straight for the hard cases that you all know well, and they are, of course, kind of rape, or particularly young girls who've had to bear a child they never intended to bear. Do you give any quarter there to the argument that there may be a case for abortion, even if, on the whole, you're against it?
No, and I don't like the way those questions are phrased. The suggestion that do I give any quarters suggests that I'm lacking in sympathy for the victims of sexual crime. I'm not. I don't think there's any more appalling thing that can be done to a person than sexual crime. But we live in a society that holds as an objective value human life. We don't allow the victims of sexual crime to execute their attackers. So it seems to me that we're placing a greater value on the human life of the attacker than on the child. And it seems to me that if you're arguing for abortion in cases of, say, rape or incest, you're basically saying, well, it's okay to visit the crimes of the father on the child, but not on the father himself.
Claire Fox?
I agree with you that human life starts at conception, and I also agree with you it's a question of rights. But the point about rights is that they're social, which is why it seems to me that the key question is that rights are only afforded to human when they enter society, when they're born, rather than when they are in the women's womb. So I wanted to ask you, because we are in danger of neglecting this, what about women's control over their reproductive destiny? That is a very big step forward for women's rights, that has been afforded.
I would say that I believe that every person should have the right over their own body, but I would take a sort of John Stuart Mill's approach of your right to wave your fist stops just short of the end of my nose. A woman's right over her body is absolute to the extent that it doesn't cause the death of another person.
But it's interesting because you've afforded rights to somebody that has not entered society, and that my point is that.
Well, you say it hasn't entered society. At what point does it enter society?
You made the point it was a genetic human life, but it's a genetic human life in a woman that only becomes a social being when it enters society.
When does it enter society then? It's born.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll ask you this question. Surgery now happens.
That's not the way it works. I asked you the questions.
Well, no, but I'm trying to respond to your question as best I can, which is we have surgery available now where children in the womb can be removed or partially removed from the womb, operated on, and put back in the womb and carried to term. When the child leaves the womb, does it become a person, and does that lose personhood when it's put back in?
But as we rightly know, the context of this is that somebody does not want to be pregnant, and their autonomous rights are to end that pregnancy. And so I'm putting to you that your rights are given, but you've arbitrarily given them at the expense of the woman's rights. That's my point. Women will be denied rights by you giving something that has not got rights artificially.
I think that the question of rights always exists in a hierarchy, and the right to life, I think, is the highest right. So, for example, if a woman or a man is found by their flatmate having ingested a lethal dose of painkillers and having written a persuasive and eloquent note on why they want to end their own life, no one would fault the flatmate for calling the ambulance, no one would fault the doctor for treating them, even though they've exercised their right to do what they want with their own body.
Okay, I have to move on to just a final last question. One of the things about choice is that I think there should be a medical procedure. The state should have nothing to do with it. Because each of those 185,000 abortions requires an individual sentient woman to make a moral choice. So it's a question of moral autonomy. Surely women should be, even if you don't approve morally, women should be free to make that moral choice, because that is the only way that you can exhibit that you are a morally autonomous person. Keep the state out, medical procedure. You don't like it, but keep out of it.
Well, I'm no champion of state intervention against individual rights, but I would say if there's ever a case for the state to intervene, it's to preserve the rights of others, particularly their right to life, and especially those who are incapable of vindicating their own rights.
Ed Condon, thank you very much indeed. Our last witness is Dr. Kate Greasley, who's a lecturer in the University College London Faculty of Laws, specialises in the ethics of abortion, which she broadly supports. Where's the moment, in your view, when a new life becomes a morally discrete human being with standing and rights? At conception, at the point of viability, at birth?
Oh, well, I don't think there is a decisive moment when personhood just snaps into existence. I don't actually think it's plausible to think that personhood happens this way. I think it's more like the gradual fading in of a property, the way that day fades into night, although I think it supervenes on certain characteristics, psychological characteristics, which themselves fade in gradually. So the question about when is the moment, for me, is more of a question of when within a reasonable margin do we need to, or is it a good idea to stipulate a moment?
Not very useful, specific for moral and legal purposes. Giles Fraser?
Well, for legal it is.
I mean, the problem with your answer, an answer which I share entirely, I mean, I agree with you, is that for legal purposes, that's actually rather difficult. So there may be a sort of mismatch between the needs of the law and actually how things are in a more complex moral space. Is that right?
Right, sort of, I would say, sort of. So I'm an objectivist about personhood. It's not that I'm saying it's a free-for-all here, what makes a person a person. I think personhood is a real moral property, and it supervenes on other real moral properties. But
I don't understand. You're going to have to speak in English, because that wasn't English to me.
Supervenes on means something depends on something else.
But, so tell me, what do you think about when personhood happens and how it happens?
So I think personhood is wrapped up in psychological characteristics, most importantly self-consciousness. You know, I don't think that something is plausibly a person if it's not self-conscious. But these properties themselves don't snap into existence, do they?
No.
They come about quite gradually. So that's why I think personhood also comes about gradually. Now, that's very different from saying it's whatever we think it is, right? It's saying, no, some things, like day and night, are real things, right? But there's no absolute moment when the one turns into another.
Given that's true, do you have some sympathy with the lawyers who actually, for obviously legal purposes, can't be as vague as you and need to have a sort of...
Right, absolutely, absolutely. So I think about law and morality slightly different here, which is not to say they're entirely separate. There are still unreasonable legal answers to this. But I think absolutely. So for legal purposes, the law can't just say, well, there's this vague area where it's kind of starting to happen, and by this time we know it's happened, right? The law needs to be clear, workable, usable, practicable, and that's going to partly inform, it's not the only consideration, but that will have to partly inform what a legal threshold is like.
We've just had a Catholic canon lawyer answering questions here, using the language of rights, which really surprised me, because rights language is not very old in the history of moral thinking, but people have been having abortions since the beginning of time. Has rights language done something to this debate? Perhaps it made it into trench warfare or something in a way that before that it wasn't.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, it makes for terrible rhetoric. I mean, usually when you hear people start to talk about fetal rights and women's rights, you know the quality of the argument is going to be pretty weak. But yeah, I mean, all I think is that rights talk probably obscures, in the way that it's used in the public arena at least, obscures the key philosophical issues here. The bottom line is, women have very serious interests in getting abortions sometimes. Procreative control interest, bodily autonomy. Now, if abortion is morally permissible, it's unjust to deny them of that.
Tim Stanley.
You just said that personhood is dependent upon self-consciousness. Now, are you...
One of the things.
I take from that, I infer from that, if I lose my self-consciousness at any point, I lose my personhood and my right to life. So, for instance, if someone goes insane and loses their sense of self, or if someone slips into a coma, it is now society's at liberty to kill them.
No, someone who is insane is self-conscious, they're just mentally disturbed. Someone who slips into a coma, this is known as the episodic problem. I think someone who has been conscious and falls unconscious reversibly is in a different situation from a single-celled zygote or an embryo, which is mostly what we're talking about.
Oh, now you're being
abortion.
medical rather than moral.
No, I'm being moral. There's a moral point.
Well, no, you're defining morality by the medical status of the person, aren't you? You're saying
no,
that
you
because
didn't
you're
let
a
me get to
zygote,
the
you
end
don't
of the
have
sentence.
self-consciousness.
You don't know what the point was going to be.
Right. OK. Now, throughout the last 50 years or so, there have been several struggles which...
Tim, I think you ought to just let her make that point.
Well,
OK, no, please,
that's
go
OK.
ahead.
It was a non sequitur that you interrupted me with, a rhetorical non sequitur, but... Go on and
Tim,
for the last
go to
50
your next
years, we've been
question.
struggling with various concepts of personhood, trying to assert them. The personhood of the disabled, the personhood of gay people, the personhood of women.
Yeah.
So why does a baby not have that kind of personhood?
Well, the language of baby is tendentious because it already presupposes that fetuses have the moral qualities that we're arguing about whether they have or not. So somebody here needed to make that point. Okay, let me give you a thought experiment. This is kind of how I usually like to work. So say you discover an alien life form, an alien culture on like planet Zorg.
Right.
And they're rational, they're communicative, they're emotionally complex, they're self-aware, they're capable of forming close relationships with each other, so on and so on. Now, I think we would have to admit that those creatures are persons, even though they're not humans. And that tells us something about our concept of a person, right? It tells us that our concept of a person isn't fundamentally rooted in humanity. Yeah. It's rooted in something else, in other sorts of traits. Now, humanity might still often correspond to those traits, but it tells us something very insightful, I think, about what personhood is fundamentally concerned with.
Well, I think it tells us that when we see life, we have an instinct to preserve it. Now,
no,
the
I'm not
question
talking
I'm
about
asking
life.
you
Life
is,
is
why is it when the life happens to be contained in a womb? Why is it when a life happens to be contained?
Life is sperm
one at a
cells.
time.
Come on.
Let Tim ask the question and then you can answer it.
Would you agree,
Last question.
Would you agree that ultimately it is the desire of the woman/doctor or the medical profession supersedes, defines the moral character of the fetus, and that is what decides for you whether or not it has personhood?
No. That's absolutely the opposite of what I said. I defined it on the basis of conceptual analysis of what a person is and what characteristics are morally relevant. That's completely different from defining something according to what you want to call a person.
OK, thank you very much indeed, Kate Greasley. Thank you very much indeed to the witnesses. So where have we got to in this argument? Actually, we skated around quite a bit here. Anne McElvoy, our first witness, Aisling Hubert. Human, a person, rights to be respected from conception, because even at conception, it's human, alive, and it's whole. And what else do you need? What would have been your view on that?
Well, my view is if that's your view, and it is an absolutist view by the fact that it states itself as such, that's fine. I think the problem that I would have with it sort of flowed a bit through the choppy waters of the debate tonight, which is that the difficult point, if you're not at absolute end of the argument, is what do you do about the middle? And I suppose that was where I think we tried to sort of engage Aisling on that. I can see that it is genuinely, I should say, very difficult for people who simply find abortion to be so wrong and such a sort of crying injustice that to engage the awkward bit in the middle about what you do about term limits, etc., feels like a bit of a distraction. But I don't feel that we did get to that. I thought what we got was a very powerful restatement of the fundamentals. I find a slight absurdity in the position that dealing with the very, very beginning of life is the same as 9 months gestation, but I appreciate that others don't, and that is why this framing is always so difficult in this debate. What is it that we're even describing when we talk about abortion term limits and what a better solution might look like?
And Claire and later Tim, both of first two witnesses, there was an element of what would happen if you engaged with the actual reality of it. You were saying it would put you off and having your appendix, this was somehow a morally questionable way of deciding this issue.
The reality of abortion is not the operation, and the morality of being squeamish about abortion should not be affected by seeing a fetus dismembered, which I I know to be very unpleasant to look at. There are lots of things that are very unpleasant to look at. That shouldn't be the basis of one's morality. The lived experience of women who have abortions is that they are pregnant when they don't want to be, and they want to not be pregnant. And we, in a very enlightened way, facilitate that. And they make that choice. And they make that choice, as I think Wendy Savage explained extremely well. They made that choice usually early, and they don't do it out of a sense of fun. They do something that they need to do. It's a medical procedure. They're not irresponsible. End of story. And I don't think it matters when the abortion procedure happens. And the reason I mention that is because we can be very squeamish about...
Hang on a second, Claire. I wanted to stay on this point about
fine.
the realities of it, because I think Tim Stanley was,
this word
with Professor Savage, was obviously operating from a different point of view.
This word squeamish keeps on coming up. I'm not here to argue for outlawing anything. I'm absolutely not here to pass any moral judgment on a woman who goes to see a doctor. What I am saying is that I fear our society is not honest about the reality of abortion. Now, Professor Savage, I was astonished when she said that perhaps the reason why many doctors would rather not carry out an abortion after 12 weeks was because of squeamishness. Well, they're not squeamish about removing a liver, are they? No. They are squeamish about an abortion because, particularly after 12 months, it requires the dismemberment of what, when you look at it, is very clearly a human being. And that is the reality of abortion. And all I'm arguing for, and the first speaker, largely all she argued for too, was let's be honest about that. And let us not either hide it behind clinical language, behind closed doors, or try and obfuscate the fact by the kind of ridiculous moral semantics and bizarre discussion that we had towards the end.
Giles, sorry to interrupt you, and do make the point that you were going to make anyway, but Professor Savage made the very useful point that the Act in 1967 was brought in to stop the dying of people from having illegal abortions.
And she's entirely right about that. Look, I think there's a dishonesty all around here, and I think Tim's being slightly dishonest too. And the dishonesty there is the pretense that actually we think that the morning after pill is the same moral equivalent, i.e. murder, as what the Las Vegas shooter did to all those people. It's not. And the idea that personhood starts there, of course, people think that's a Christian position. It's not always been the Christian position that life begins at conception. There has been a very reputable tradition of Christian thought that life begins with this thing called quickening, which is when the baby, this is a sort of Middle Ages type of thing, that baby starts kicking in your womb and there starts to be some sort of activity, and there's something different there between 3 or 4 cells. It has to be the case that there is a moral difference between a clump of cells and a fully formed human being and how we treat them.
At no point have I compared the morning after pill with the shooter in Las Vegas. We're not talking about a small clump of cells when we're talking about the 24 weeks upper limit we currently have. And I am not making any of those arguments that you have suggested that I've made. On the contrary, I'm talking about simply discussing the reality and testing our conscience as a society.
OK, Tim. Now, Claire Fox, this central question of the point at which something gains personhood or gains rights, we seem to have skated around that all evening. How can we do this? What judgments can we apply?
Well, first of all, there will be an argument, but I think that was an interesting concession that Tim's just made, because that's really my point. I don't think that this is an easy question, but I think that society knows that there are not 185,000 babies being murdered by a nihilistic, savage mass murderer every year, as in the number of abortions. That's why they're not up in arms. And sometimes they're not sure about it morally. But the reason I mention that is because I think that people understand it's a different thing. I have every respect for those people who say life begins at conception. I'm anti-abortion. I mean, I argued that for years, right? That's what I thought. But I also used to go on platforms and say, and it's like a mass Holocaust. And then I actually found out about the quickening and St. Thomas Aquinas agreeing. And I started thinking maybe, and the most important thing that I realised something. I know that I think one of our witnesses, Kate, said anyone who mentions women's rights as a shallow thinker, well, let me say it loud and clear. Shallow thinker I might be. This is about women's rights to control their reproduction. And then I realised that I was actually sentimentalising a fetus. That's what I was doing, and I stopped doing it. I had a different approach.
Yeah, Anne, can we get back to the question I asked Claire and she didn't answer it?
It's a shallow thinking.
Shallow thinker that I am, every time.
The last witness, Kate Greasley, talked about it not being a clear-cut moment, it's a matter of fading in and so on, but actually introduced the idea of self-consciousness as the test of personhood. How far did that go with you? I
think it's a credible argument. I think personhood, which Kate was grappling with under some sustained pressure from the other side of the table, is a very, very slippery philosophical concept, which is why it's so fascinating. It really is like wrestling with a bucket of eels. And the reason that you can get away with an idea as attractive and vague as the quickening is they didn't really have to say much more about it. Then something seemed to be moving about a bit. That now, I'm afraid, won't do because we know too much. And I think we're in a very interesting territory on this when we come to term limits, where I said my opinion has moved not far but either side of weak limits. And I think a lot of people feel, if anything, that's the argument argument that we need to be having in a much more ferocious way with ourselves is, when do we think it's okay? Because if you accept that it's ever okay, it's because personhood is not fully established, and when don't we? So I don't think Kate got to the bottom of it, but I did think she had a brave try at getting to the subject that would probably cause me most moral trouble.
Giles, Professor Savage said at one particular point, she didn't think that it was up to doctors to have moral discussions about these things, that this was a practical solution that women were forced to come to, and something they wished had never happened.
You see, this is the point where, I can sound terribly pro-choice until it comes to this point. And then the problem is when people start saying an abortion is like just having your bunion done or something like that, and it just actually, I'm afraid it isn't like that. There are all sorts of rather important moral discussions that I think it's right and proper that you have if you're considering one. And I think the problem with, Professor Savage is a practitioner, and she is, I think, very keen to defend, and I respect this, defend the woman's right to choose. But I think in her activism about this, she misses the fact that there is actually a much more subtle and finely grained argument that needs to go on with people who are thinking about this and thinking about whether it's the right thing to do.
Tim, briefly.
Crucially, it's an argument that affects all of us. I like the fact we've all more or less agreed that the concept of personhood is at least important and is where rights come from in many senses. In which case, if we are conscious of the personhood and the rights of disabled people, does it not affect their rights, their personhood, that 90% of babies which are diagnosed in the womb as having Down syndrome are aborted? Does that not have some clear impact upon grown disabled people's own sense of personhood and rights, that people like them can be so discarded from in the womb on the grounds of their disability?
Anne, last word with you.
Well, I was just thinking, I found it absolutely fascinating tonight, and I'd be pulled both ways. But if I were faced with a decision in my own life or those close to me in which abortion was an option, I would look at it as a balance of harms and benefits, and both apply. There are real harms, they've been outlined by people on that side of the argument tonight, but there are benefits, and the difficulty that we have is deciding where the state should step in. It has perhaps made me more towards what we call pro-choice, or the more liberal side of the argument on abortion than I was when I started.
Panel, thanks very much. That's it for this week. You can now go to the Radio 4 website and test your ability to argue based on a special academic analysis of tonight's programme. From our panel, Anne McElvoy, Claire Fox, Tim Stanley and Giles Fraser, and from me, until the same time next week, good night.